Hello.
Hello, everybody.
Hello. Hi there. How are you? Greetings. Good evening and welcome to Sacred Stories, a cathartic conversation on pains, pleasures, pleasantries, and powers of women in ministry. Wayland Baptist Theological Seminary, recognizing the historic Baptist ideas around the distinctive we call the priesthood of all believers, believes that women in ministry, particularly our Baptist women in ministry, are essential to the work of God in the church, the academy, and the world. We are delighted to have you, our Facebook Live and YouTube viewers from around the continental USA and the world. You can support the work of women in ministry and Wayland Baptist Theological Seminary via Cash App at $J Rebels, PayPal at paypal.me/WBTS1812, or you can send your checks or money orders payable to Wayland Baptist Theological Seminary, Post Office Box 2721, Onico, Florida, 34264 -9800. Before we get started, let's meet our conversational partners. Senior pastor of First Baptist Church of Bridgehampton, New York, and founder, innovator of Who's That Lady Ministries. Please welcome the Reverend Tisha Dixon Williams.
Hello, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be on this platform, especially with so many women that I've admired from afar. Thank you for having me.
Senior and founding pastor of Anointed New Life Baptist Church, Henrico, Virginia. Please welcome the Reverend Dr. C. Diane Mosby.
Good evening, everyone. It is a joy to be with you all tonight. I am looking forward to an engaging conversation with sisters that I too have admired and grateful for the invitation to be with you.
Pastor of Church Life at Cathedral International, the historic Second Baptist Church of Perth Amboy, New Jersey. Please welcome the Reverend Dr. Danielle L. Brown.
Good evening, everyone. I am so grateful for the opportunity to share, and I am also looking forward to a wonderful, rich, and enlightening dialogue with my sisters in ministry.
Pastor Emerita of Covenant Freedom Church, Lansdowne, Pennsylvania. Please welcome the Reverend Cassandra M. McElwee.
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be able to have this conversation. These are important conversations to be had. And I'm excited to be able to have this conversation with such a dynamic group of women. I look forward to it.
Senior and founding pastor of Empowerment Liberation Cathedral, presiding bishop of Numa Christian Fellowship and president of Empowerment Justice Center and EJC Wellness Center. Please welcome Dr. Allison D. Nelson Abrams.
Praise the Lord, everybody. I am honored to be here on tonight. I'm excited about the conversation. We truly have a dynamic group of women in ministry here, women who have done so many things and have so much to talk about. I'm looking forward to the conversation on tonight.
I am your host, the Reverend E. Rochelle Bess. So here we are, women in ministry, ready to have a serious, stimulating, and sacred conversation about life. Now, we often see matriarchs after their elevation, but what about the pain behind the ministry or the call? The prophets Miriam and Hannah experienced pain. Miriam, who is a deliverer and way shower, is often overlooked in the Exodus story and not given the credit she is due. Hannah suffers from societal guilt and shame, not being able to produce an heir, doing what was deemed to be her part. Both in a culture that did not always value women in ministry, service, and life. Tell us about a painful time in your life as you sought to pursue God's call to ministry. The floor is open.
I mean, the easiest thing to say is which one, but because it's hard. But I remember early on in the ministry, in my walk in ministry, that I was a single mother, and I was very committed to providing my son with a very stable lifestyle, and part of that was bedtime. And so I had this rule that for the most part, from the time I got home from work around 3 until 8 o'clock when he went to bed, I was pretty much all about him, to give him the things that he needed and the stability that he needed. And I was coming through a ministry, and there would be this time where people would say stuff like, you could make that meeting. You could do that. Your mother could watch him. But he wasn't my mother's child, right? Or it would be this idea that I should be able to just do it. But the brothers that were in ministry, I was in ministry with, had a wife to be at home, to be able to take care of the things that would be able to be taken care of. And when I would express that I just didn't have the resources, and sometimes resources are people resources that they had, and I was also committed to being a mother, that they would exclude me. And I said, if you had a meeting at 8 o'clock instead of 7 o'clock, I could be here, but I just couldn't be there at a 7 o'clock meeting. But what it ended up doing was that they would characterize my not being there as a lack of interest in ministry, or a lack of commitment, or me being emotional about something. And at the time, I was very young. I was in my 20s. Sometimes you wish that people would say the things in your 40s that they said to you in your 20s, because you'd have an answer. You'd have the maturity to answer them. But I didn't have the maturity to answer. So I would just kind of take it and just feel like, maybe I wasn't cut out, or what kind of thing. And it ended up, for a while, it made me leave ministry because I just felt harassed. And I felt like, I couldn't get through. So I think that when you talk about this, there's things that have been more painful, but I think that when you're trying to do what's right before God, and then people are not respectful of the other things that you have to do. And, I will have to give an account with the kind of man that I was put before God, if I was, and I didn't want him to be like a kid who never knew where his mom was, or, that kind of thing. And I was also finishing up school. So it was all those other issues, that it was very painful that the place that had built me, the church, could not support me as a mother, and I think that was very painful. And it was also this idea of, you're a single parent, you should have been married when you got pregnant, right? And you should have been married, you weren't married. And if you were married, you would have the resources that you need. And so this is what's due to you, And that was not said explicitly to my face, but it certainly was the attitude, And I remember going through the board of examiners, and because I was an AME at that time, And he said, what took you so long to get here? And I said, well, I was finishing school or something else. And then this man in my face, and this is a person who was notoriously had like, had women in the church, was always sleeping with women in the church, but he's examining me and he says, and I mentioned, he said, do you have any children? I said, one child. He said, oh, I see what you were doing. I see why you didn't get here. And I said, that was when I was, I just had just enough. I was close enough to 30 to have an edge. And I said, well, what do you see? And then he cleaned it up, but I knew what he meant. So that's an example of that for me.
Well, maybe I should follow that since I also was a single parent. I was divorced in seminary, working on or starting my MDiv. And I will say I got a lot of that, but I even got from a male pastor, you're going to struggle because you're a single woman with 3 kids. So just no question about anything, just spoke it on me. But I always drug my children to all the Progressive Baptist conventions, all of the state Baptist meetings, every meeting. My children had to go. And so that's just kind of how it was. And so a lot of things I was not invited to because I did not have anybody to keep my children. One of the challenges for me was when I would apply to churches, because I knew that I was called to pastor, I would get what I like to call Dear John letter, or Dear Jane, I should say. But I would get that same letter knowing that I had a DMin, I had MDiv, and I also had served as an associate. And that was back, I got my DMin in 2005. So now I had all of this education, and my brother counterparts who didn't have the education, didn't do an MDiv, didn't do a DMin, was getting churches like they was giving out candy. And so it was very hurtful because I'm like, okay, I'm very qualified, probably overqualified. And the people who are not qualified, y'all keep giving it to them. And so, some of them weren't married. So I don't want to say it's because they were married. Some of them were not. It was just because they were a male and I was a female. And so that was very painful for many years to know that churches, just because of my gender, would not call me to be the pastor. And some of them wouldn't let you be the assistant pastor. It's fine. You can come and work as a Sunday school person, superintendent, missionary. They could let you be an evangelist, as they called it. But, it just really was disheartening to know that because of my gender, some days I felt maybe I should go and dress up like a man and go in there and preach and see what they say. But, it just was very disheartening and disappointing to know that church is the place that's supposed to trust God and trust God's decision and trust God's call, could not see beyond gender. And so that was very painful for me for many, many, many years.
I'll jump in here as someone who is the opposite, who does not have children. And I would dare say the pain is just as acute for someone who does not have children. I can remember preaching, and this was as an associate minister, and we're never as vulnerable as we are after the preaching moment. There's never a more time where you're more raw or vulnerable than after the preaching moment. And I can remember coming down from the pulpit and sort of heading to the back after the benediction and waiting to sort of shake hands and greet. And a woman comes up to me with no comment about the sermon, but rather, when are you gonna have kids? And that was an ongoing question, not understanding that I had been, at that point, fertility challenged for at least 5 years. And so it was this idea that, nothing I'll ever do will be as great as having children. And not only is it an invasive question, but it becomes a very emotional question when you know what you have been through in that regard. And while this was probably one of the most painful moments for me, it was also the aha moment for me, because after she asked me that question, my friend, a fellow minister, another sister, steps in and says, she gives birth every time she preaches. And I can't tell you what she said to that or what her response was, because it was a light bulb went off in my head. And all of a sudden it was, I sure do. The blood, the sweat, the tears, the late nights, the crying, the agony, the ecstasy, how I give them back to God, how they don't belong to me, how I dedicate them back to people for the upliftment of others. You know, as you say, children are not raised for a home, they're raised for abroad. Yeah, I give birth every time I preach. And while that was a painful moment, it became a pivotal moment. It helped me to reframe what that meant for me. And so, in as much as I would not wish that question on any woman, preacher or otherwise, and it was painful, it helped me to sort of reframe how I look at motherhood when we talk about Hannah. And I began to think of these sermons as my babies. Certainly not to replace what it means to be a biological mother, but I stand on it. Yeah, I give birth every week. I have more children than most. So yeah, that was a painful moment for me. That became a very pivotal moment for me.
Wow. So I will jump in and wow, that's an amazing way to look at it as someone who is child free at this point in my journey as well. But a painful moment in my journey. 2006, I transitioned from full-time teaching into full-time ministry. And I was so excited about the possibility and just excited and had so much vision and so many ideas. And one day, in having a conversation with a person who was on my ministry team, he shared with me that a conversation had been had with some other folks in the context, and that it was stated that a woman was never supposed to be the youth pastor. At that time, I was transitioning to full-time ministry as a youth pastor, and he went down the list of people that it should have been. But because of whatever the circumstances were in their lives, here I was. And so that was a painful moment, because in the midst of all of the progress that had been made in a quick period of time and all of the envisioning and the excitement, those words, you know, they say sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That's a lie. Words hurt. And those, why I say, and of course, our sister said, the question is which experience, right? So there's many that we can go down the line of things that have happened, but that particular encounter, those words stuck with me for several years. Every time I wanted to proceed or pursue something, I would hear those words, right? That you're only here by default, right? It was never supposed to be like you. And so for several years, those words traveled with me and were equally painful every time, right? They would kind of, you know, come to the surface. And so through that though, and in working through why it hurt and all of that, you know, I came to the realization, and I'm sure, right, that God did not call me by default. And that who God intended for me to be, God knew that I was a girl when he formed me in my mother's womb, right? He knew the journey that I would be on, and that none of where I have landed has been by happenstance or because of someone else's choices with their own life. That God was very intentional about my journey. And so that was a painful moment that I, in hindsight, feel like robbed too much from me, right? When I look at it now, all these years later, almost 16 years later, I feel like that encounter and that conversation got too much of my energy over the years, right? But now I'm at a place where it's like, all right, it's all good. But it was painful. That doesn't erase that it hurt when it happened. Yeah.
So I guess it's my time to jump in, ladies. You all have blessed me with part of your stories, and thank you for the value of them. I think I probably can touch on pretty much most of the pain that has been expressed. I want to say that probably the most painful moment for me was my call to plant. I had worked as an associate minister. I had worked as an executive pastor, and really was on a path of elevation where I was. And God started to shake up some things, and God started to move some things. And when I was called to plant the church, those who I thought would celebrate the elevation could not get to it. They felt that, it was okay for me to work as an associate minister. It was okay for me to work in the executive role, but to call as a pastor, they could just not support it. And not only could they not support it, but they would applaud it in public and demonize it in private. And when God started to reveal the demonization of what they were doing in the background, it was very painful to watch the platitudes around people that they respected, but in the background was also doing things behind the scenes to make sure that different opportunities that should have been a given for a Baptist pastor was not a door that would be opened for me. And so the pain of walking through that and watching people that you respected and that you trusted throughout your journey to turn their back on you and to really demonize your name in places that they thought would hold back what God was doing in your life was a very painful period for me. But again, as many of the sisters have said, we could probably speak on several, but that one was the most painful one for me, but it also taught me some very valuable lessons about the validation of people is not where our call comes from. God's validation is what we need. And when we stand, God has called and what God has ordained, God makes the doors open and God makes the way. And so even throughout the journey, it's still painful to think back on that period when God was shifting me and God was elevating those who would in public say such wonderful things about what she did at the church and what she was capable of. But in the association meetings, y'all know what I'm talking about, when the decisions were made at the table and you found out about the information after the decisions, or if you found out at all, you would stumble onto things. Those were very painful moments for me.
Thank you, ladies. The prophet and judge Deborah experienced the pleasures of accomplishment and authority. People respected her voice. Can you recall a time when you felt welcomed and not tolerated as a woman in ministry? And what contributed to that experience?
Here's what's funny about this. When we talked about pain, there was no shortage of stories that we could tell. And here now we have the opportunity to share our pleasures, and it's, let me think. I think that we probably have as many joys as we've had pains. It's just a little harder to sift through them, maybe. For me, I don't know that it was one particular incident in as much as it's all sort of evolved over time, that you sort of experience these wins throughout the journey. If you can say wins, these highs, these moments of acceptance. I think for me, to date would probably be the moment that I was elected the pastor of this church, this historic African-American church in the East End of Long Island in New York. And I was elected right before our 94th church anniversary. So the first woman elected to this position. That was a really great moment where I felt accepted. Having said that and feeling that, I also knew because someone didn't hesitate to tell me that I only got the position by 4 votes. Information I could have lived my whole life without knowing. So, but that was okay, right? Because I was here and I couldn't afford to sit in that place, but fully understanding that I was coming into a split church for all intents and purposes, half the church did not elect me. And that too was okay. And so I had to figure out a way very quickly to sort of win them over. And knowing that this is a very sports driven town, for my first sermon as the pastor-elect, I preached a sermon about teamwork. And I talked about the teamwork that was evidenced in the raising of Jairus' daughter. Jesus sort of leading the team going in, putting out the opposers or the mourners. So they all working as a team to bring this young girl up. And at the end of the sermon, I talked about being draft picks, being a draft pick. And I said, as a matter of fact, I feel like your number one draft pick. And I pulled out a hat, just like they do in the draft, that said Bridgehampton on it. And everybody was excited and cheering. And in that moment, I felt like I was accepted. I felt like I was a part of the community. And I wasn't delusional. I knew this was still going to take a lot of work to bridge the gap with the people and connect with them. But in that moment, I felt like, okay, yeah, we can do this. We can do this. We can win, and we can do it as a team. So that was a really great moment. And there's several moments like that. And I think it evolves and it happens over time. But that was a really great moment.
I would agree. I think that the fresh winds come. The fresh winds continue to affirm what God is doing in and through your life. And for me, it has been the fresh winds of watching what God has done in Anointed New Life for 12 years, how God has continued to draw persons to the ministry, how the disciples of the church have grown in their life and relationship with Jesus Christ, their service to the community, how the church itself has just become a beacon light in the community and has been seen as a viable church, a viable faith community in the community. And so those fresh winds that come, the miracles that we have seen God do within the body of Christ that I serve. And then I think the other thing for me that was a pleasantry, I guess, or a pleasure, was being called back to a seminary to preach for the chapel service, and just to be affirmed by your colleagues that you have something to say for the Lord, and that that your presence is valued, and that what you are doing and offering in the community does not go unnoticed. I think those two things of the fresh winds are what come to mind for me right now. Like I said, there are many, but those two really stand out, that God has sustained us, kept us, grown us, used us, been beacon light in this community for over 12 years. The growth, the power of God in our community, to see the disciples' maturity, to grow and to love God even more, and to love the community and their neighbor, and then to be able to just be among colleagues who appreciate who you are and who you stand for and what you bring to the table. So thank you.
Wow, those are powerful, powerful stories. And I just have to say to Reverend Dixon, I thought I was the only one. Well, they had to tell you, you only won by a certain number of votes. And so when I was called to the first church I was called to in Detroit, I was the youngest female to ever be called to a Black Baptist congregation in the city of Detroit. So that says a lot. And I think I was only the fourth female at that point to be called to be pastor of a Black Baptist church in Detroit. And so when they took the time, somebody, I don't remember who it was, took the time to say, well, you only won by 5 votes. And so, I knew at that point too, I had a split congregation. So I had to go in with the mindset, okay, I'm everybody's pastor, doesn't matter if they did or did not vote for me. And so I really felt great about joining the ranks of women who were called to pastor a church. And then another time for me, because as I believe Dr. Mosby said, it's not just one. Another time was to only be the third woman to preach at the Progressive National Baptist Convention's annual session. That was years ago. To know how Reverend Brenda Little labored and fought for women to be able to do things in that particular convention, and how much pushback we always got from the men, especially even to preach in the minister seminar. Y'all remember those. And so, it was an honor, but I'm not going to say they didn't have a stunt that was done, but it was still an honor to have my name on the roster. Okay. Some of y'all know the stunt that they pull on a Friday, but it was still an honor. I was very honored and very happy to even be able to stand before the body of people who were left and did not leave on that day. Lastly, it is just a tremendous joy for me to pastor Empowerment Liberation Cathedral, and a church where people had said that I would not make it, and we would not make it to 7 years. We just celebrated 7 years. I did not want to be a church planter again, but I knew that God said this is what I had to do, coming out of being called to a church where the building is already there. Y'all know where everything is already there. Y'all got a parking lot, you got people doing everything, but then you got to start over. But I knew what God said to do. And so it has been a great joy to be there for 7 years, doing ministry, healing hearts, and saving souls and raising up leaders. And so I'm just so excited about those things on my journey.
Wow. I will say, and there have been a number of moments too that have been those kind of refreshing moments where I have felt embraced as a woman in ministry. But I'm thinking about 3 that were very similar. And the first was not that maybe about 5 years ago, I was preaching locally, and a little girl, I was preaching for a convention actually of locally, but a denomination that is not my own. And a little girl came up to me, and she was just, like amazed. And she said to me, "You're the first girl I've ever seen preach." And it was like, wait, this is just about 5, maybe 6 years ago. And it's like, there are still little girls who are, hearing a girl preach for the first time. And so she and I had a conversation. She wanted to take a picture with me. And so, we took a picture, and that was a moment that was like, you know what? As a woman, I had the opportunity to be for that little girl what women like Dr. Cynthia Hale, Dr. Prathia Wynn, Dr. Bernadette Glover, Dr. Claudette Copeland, like what those women were to me as a little girl. Then one day I'm preaching in my own at the cathedral, and a man comes up to me after service, and he said, "I never believed in women in ministry." And of course, our senior pastor is a man, but this brother had been sitting there, and he's like, "But you have preached the last several weeks, and if and now I'm a believer that you have convinced me that women can hold their own." That was another moment. And then another time was a pillar in our community. One of our gatekeepers, he's gone to be with the Lord just last year. After I finished preaching at a convention, I'm Baptist, and so we were at a Baptist convention, I preached, and he was hollering behind me, but he came up to me after, and he said, "I have struggled with this." And it was notorious that he did not necessarily agree with women in ministry. And he said to me that if he, that he had struggled with it, but that the straw that broke the camel's back for him in favor of women preaching was what I did that night. And so those were moments, right, that were pivotal in the lives of other people, where being able to be in those spaces where I just have done what God has called me to do, has changed the perspective of someone else as it pertains to women in ministry. Those are refreshing moments, in addition to so many others, but I'll give those 3.
The question about being welcomed is always interesting to me. So the way she phrased that question about being welcomed is because, when people need real ministering, they're always welcoming when you have something to say. You know what I mean? Like when they really need to be ministered to, and they're really in a pit, they welcome you ministering to them, and somehow they can get over the gender at that point. That's what I found it to be. When they really need somebody, and you've made yourself available. So I've always felt welcome when people really need ministry, But I belong to a group called Fellowship of Women Clergy, and it was one of the first times outside of my denomination where I just met women who were in ministry who just loved the Lord and welcomed me, just liked me. just accepted me as Cassandra. I didn't have to be perfect. And it came at such a perfect time in my life because I had just lost my father and I was getting through that grief. And I needed to talk about it a lot. And I don't think people were necessarily making space for me to do that. And they just would let me talk and they would just accept it. And then they would like invite me to lunch and do other things. And it was a way that I met women who were outside the group. And which is what, when I thought about this, the thing that triggered this memory is because when, I think it's Pastor Dixon Williams, I want to make sure I get your name right, but when she told that story, I think about how, as a woman in ministry, it's been Black women in ministry who have held me up, you know, that when I was really falling down, I don't get me wrong, there could be competition in ministry as well, but it has been that when I have needed, when I've been in women in ministry, it's been other women in ministry who have been like, you know, kind of showing me how to go through a door and showing me exactly what to expect or walking me through a process. And it can be both liturgical processes and other and just like life processes that have really been the most welcoming and the most handholding. And there's a way in which I've experienced women in this process. And don't get me wrong, like again, there are some women who, you know, they don't feel like there's only two people in the room for one at the top, so they can't welcome you. But there's been another way in which I think in ministry, many times people act like they're pledging you into ministry, right? But when I've been walked through with women, they've nurtured me into ministry, you know, and that doesn't mean they haven't challenged me, but it's just been, I've experienced them differently. And that's probably why I have stayed in ministry. And what reminded me of that story was when she said that, and she said another woman came in and answered for her, right? Because in that moment, that other woman was aware of her pain and just didn't allow that. And I think that that's the thing that women in ministry can do for other women sometimes.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies. The Prophet Hulda's conversation is a hard conversation. It's conflicting, comforting, and confirming. Some pioneers in ministry have had to share truth that isn't comfortable or welcomed. How have you navigated the complexities of preaching truth to power and doing prophetic ministry when it's not popular?
One of the things I used to say when I was invited to churches was, well, I would go ahead and say this because I got a plane ticket to go back home with. And so, you know, I would go ahead and step out there and put it out there and know that I was going home. But here I have intentionally dealt with subjects that some people did not want to hear, did not want to talk about, but it seemed that it was necessary to deal with in that season. And so I am one of the people who may be called radical, may be called edgy, because I will talk about it. For example, sexuality in the church. A lot of people don't want to talk about that, especially Black churches, but we have to talk about it because obviously people are doing it and there's a lot of it going on, and some authors and theologians are writing about it. And so we have to bring it to the people in the pews. And so I think it takes courage, it takes boldness, it takes confidence, because you will get the questions as well. And you cannot be worried about who's not going to like you after you bring a subject matter to the people and after you challenge the people. And if somebody doesn't like you because you brought something to the people, then I think that may be somebody you have to reassess whether you need to still be connected with. And so even in Detroit, before I left, I had to do a lot of reassessing because some people didn't like certain things that I said and did. And so, you know, if I know that I'm led by God and the anointing of God is on me to do what I'm doing and it is blessed, then I have to go ahead and do it. And so I think you have to do it in boldness. You have to have courage. You can't be afraid. And, you know, if somebody shuts you down, surely another door will open to you. And so you have to change your perspective. I think that's the easiest way to do that type of ministry.
Yeah, that's good, Bishop. And I think, you know, I think that the standard for anything that we do in ministry, right, is speaking the truth also in love. And I think when we're dealing with topics that are difficult for people to digest, my daddy, Harold Brown, has always said, it's not your business what people do with the truth after you tell it, right? So that's one standard, right? But then holding to the standard of truth and love, asking yourself, was it true? And did I speak it in love? And if those things are so, then I ascribe to what my daddy said. It's not your business what people do with it after that. Like, you can't brace yourself, right? I think, and we might always walk through this kind of bracing ourselves, like, how are people going to receive it? But if at the end of the day, when it's just us and God, we can sleep and we can feel well, and we're holding ourselves to that standard, that ethic of love and truth, then we're good. So I don't know that other than bracing myself sometimes, but after it's out there, if I know that it measures up in truth, it measures up being delivered in love, I sleep good. I don't really think about it.
I think that was fantastic. I mean, all of this is just so rich. This is so amazing. And to hear all of your perspectives, it's fantastic and super helpful, by the way. I think for me, in a nutshell, is I'm more afraid of God than I am of you. And I'm not, and God, it's one thing for you to worry me to death. It's another thing for God to worry me to death. I want to go to bed. I don't want to be up wrestling and upset and wondering, did I do what I was assigned to do? Is God pleased? I have experienced God having to tell me more than once. That is a horrible experience. And I don't want that. And so in a nutshell, I'm more afraid of God than I am of you. I have to do what I was called to do. And I love what Dr. Brown said, but I have to do it in love. The quote, anything will give up its secret if you love it enough. And that is what I think about. I also subscribe to what I have coined emotionally intelligent preaching, where you have to, before you even come to the desk, when you are sitting at your desk, you make a full examination and a self-aware assessment of where am I in this? And if this is where I am, do I run the risk now of bleeding all over people or using my gift irresponsibly and with the potential of hurting my congregation instead of helping my congregation? And when we talk about emotional intelligence, I have to be self-aware, I have to self-manage, I have to have the right motivation, because oftentimes things will happen and we'll come to the desk motivated by our own desires, right? Motivated by the heat of our passion and not motivated by what God has called us to do. Do I have empathy? Am I empathetic? Do I have my finger on the pulse of how everyone else in the congregation is feeling about this? And then, am I socially aware of what's happening to everyone? I think in as much as this COVID-19 crisis has been horrible, one of the things I've been saying is COVID is a snitch. It did not create problems, but rather it revealed problems. And we have the benefit now of being in what Dr. Frank Thomas calls a shared human experience. And so now it's almost easier to preach because we know what everyone is going through. I don't have to pull and draw straws and fast and pray, Lord, what do you want? I know what everybody's going through because I'm going through it too. And I think that that's what we have to do when we have these tough messages. As Dr. Brown said, we have to do it in love, but we have to be come to the desk with emotional intelligence so that we do no harm in those moments. And one of the challenges I'll say personally for this church is when I came here, we started to get an influx. It's a historical Black Baptist church, but we started to get an influx of white Catholic women. people were coming in from the Catholic Church. I've baptized more people from the Catholic Church in my 3 years here than I have Black people, which is very interesting. And so when we come into this pandemic and then we start to get into the pandemic of racism, and now I have to speak truth to power after George Floyd dies, I was nervous. So now what are my Caucasian members gonna say? And I decided they need to hear it too. Because again, at the end of the day, I'm more afraid of God than I am of you. I have a responsibility. And I had to reframe it and say, this is not just a word for Black people, it's a word for all people. And so, yeah.
Dr. Dixon, I appreciate that last statement you said, that it's not a word for Black people, it's a word for all people. And I think that when we come to the desk, knowing that we have a responsibility to all people, to do it in love and do it in compassion and in empathy. I think that the authenticity of who we are comes through. And I think the authenticity of God using us in that moment helps people to receive the message even more when they know that you are a loving, caring, compassionate person. For me, oftentimes God deals with me first before he allows me to bring the message to somebody else. And so oftentimes in preparation of the word, I'm convicted. I'm the one that's got to hold the mirror up. I'm the one that's got to address, this hard place. God, am I being faithful? And am I walking this walk? And am I doing what you have called me to do before I can even bring it to the people? And so for me, it's that place of love, compassion, and authenticity that comes together as I bring forth those words of concern, sometimes those hard messages, sometimes those challenging messages. But when, as Wade Nobles would say, know thyself and be thyself true, when I can be myself true in the authentic moment, people know that you are authentic. They know that you are coming from a place of authenticity, and you're coming to a place that has worked with you. And has challenged you and has grown you and matured you in a light that they can now see themselves through that lens and know that Pastor's bringing a message that's necessary. And she's bringing a message. We may not want to hear it, but it's a message that will stretch and grow and challenge. And the authenticity of who she is comes through with that message to challenge all of us to grow and to be better. So.
Thank you, ladies. Mary of Nazareth and Mary, nicknamed Magdalene, are two New Testament powerhouses. Mary of Nazareth, prophetic declaration, shows us a woman who stands her ground by reclaiming and asserting her own authority. While neither God nor Gabriel thought it was necessary to get Mary's consent, she gives it anyway. Magdalene, the apostle to the apostles, proclaims the sole and central message of our ancient faith. Jesus gives her the authority to speak on his behalf. These two powerful women reinforce the reality of powerful women used by God for great works. I am sure we can appreciate that these women, as well as all those we do not have time to mention, are sheroes. Reverend Dr. Dixon Williams, I am sure you can appreciate that these women, as well as those we do not have time to mention, are superheroes with superpowers. So preachers, what are your superpowers?
First, oh my God, this is totally right up my alley. I'm a super geek for those of you who don't know. And I always say this about Mary Magdalene. I say that if the disciples were the Justice League, Mary Magdalene was Wonder Woman. She was the glue that held them all together. We know that Dr. Renita Weems submit that she should have been the apostle that replaced Judas when the time came, because of how super amazingly dope she was. So I will say this as a woman in ministry. Some people would say it is my kryptonite. I have found it to be my superpower is my emotional intelligence and my ability to be emotional. I am a heart person through and through. And while sometimes that may get me in trouble, and there are times when I do pray, Lord, why didn't you make me more just, why can I be more hard and more like stone and just logical and have all this grit, right? But I'm Melba Milquetoast. But here's what I know. I have learned to embrace it. And here's what I knew it was my superpower. Again, when I came to the First Baptist Church of Bridgehampton, they had been void of a pastor for 3 years. And so they were without a pastor's love, without that connection. So who better to send here than someone who is just warm and fuzzy and loves to hug and and like be in people's space and be Melba Milquetoast all the time. I know very clearly that I was sent here with a goal to love people back to health. I don't know beyond that why else I was sent other than for the normal pastoral duties, but I know for sure I was sent here to love them back to health. And the only way that I can do that is by tapping into my emotional power, that emotional intelligence that says, at the end of the day, I am an empath. I do feel what other people are feeling. Sometimes it's overwhelming. It's a bit much for me. I do need to take breaks. I do have to find, as Superman, my fortress of solitude sometimes, but it's my superpower. I wouldn't have it any other way. I love what Dr. Brown said. That little girl said, "You're the first girl I've ever seen do." That's a superpower. Just being a trailblazer, that's all of our superpowers. But here's the best part. We're not just trailblazers. We're path pavers. It's one thing to knock all the trees down and blaze the trail. It's another thing to then go back and pave it so that it's easier for other people. So I think that that's our superpower. My superpower is emotion. I'm a ball of emotions, but I know how to, I've learned how to wield them when. And I've also not shied away from what people would consider negative emotion. You can't be positive all the time. I put a post up yesterday that says positive only batteries don't work. And I've learned that even with emotion, I have to let negative in too, because negative sometimes becomes my governor and allows me to adjust. And that if it don't feel good, that's okay too. So for me, my superpower is being a big old walking bleeding heart. If I can say that.
My superpower, I too am a people person, and they call me the whisperer. They just tell me all the time that people are just drawn to me because of my compassion and love. And I really believe that that's what God has used me to be able to do. There are places and spaces where so many people are broken and so many people are hurting, and they just need a space and a place and a person that will affirm them, that will love them, that will encourage them, that will allow them to know that they are special, that they are valued, that God loves them, and that there's a space for them. And for me, my superpower, I believe, is that whisperer that can allow people to know that you are valued, that you are loved, that you are respected, that you are needed, and that there's a place and a space for you. I think the person that I most relate to in the Word of God is Eve. And Eve and I have been on this journey for a minute now, because so often when we hear in Eve's story, it's always about all of the stuff that she did wrong, and that we never lift up her humanity. We never lift up the unique, awesome, wonderful mother, woman, wife, trailblazer, blazer that Eve was. And oftentimes we look at Eve as the person who helped to usher the quote unquote sin into the world, but we don't look at her humanity after that moment, how she was redeemed by God, how she was still used to be the mother of all living things, how she just continued to go forward to do the things that needed to be done, that those who came with and behind her were affirmed, and that their humanity was affirmed. And so for me, I relate very strongly to the redemption of Eve and her life and her life's worth, and that love and compassion that was just brought forth through her humanity, to be the nurturer, the mother of all living things, and to see that we are generationally a part of who Eve was. It brings joy to me to be able to whisper that to other people, that regardless of whether or not you've fallen, regardless of whether or not you've made a mistake, that God is a God of redemption, and God is a God of love, and God is a God that accepts us who and where we are and brings us into the fold and allows us to be the authentic, beautiful people that he has created us to be. And so for me, my superpower is just affirming people and reminding them that regardless of what you had to deal with and regardless of where you've been on your journey, that God still loves you, that there's a place for you, that God is still opening doors for you and opportunities for you and allowing healing space for you to come in and be whole and then to be able to be used for the kingdom of God. And so I just love telling the story of Eve, and I just love allowing God to use me in those spaces to affirm people who have been broken, who have been marginalized, who have been discarded, who have been hurt, and allow them to find a healing space that they can come in and know that they will be respected and they will be valued and they will have opportunity to use the gifts that God has for them.
I think I appreciate all that, and I appreciate the healing space. And I think the reason why I appreciate it so much is because my superpower, if it would be anything, it would be that I am forgiving. And I've learned to forgive lavishly. And that doesn't mean I don't have boundaries. And I know that many times people look at the fact that I'm forgiving as a weakness. But the fact is that the way I forgive the way I do forgive, because I'm aware of my own sin and I'm aware of my own shortcomings. And because of that, I know what it means to make a mistake, you know? And so because I know what it means to make a mistake and to step into a situation where, you've done things that you shouldn't have done, or said things you shouldn't have said, or gone places you shouldn't have gone. And the other reason why I can be so forgiving is, I think about that because it's so confirming. The sister just talked about that story of Eve, because if you remember that story of Eve, afterwards, when they said that they were naked and ashamed, the Bible says that the Lord gave them clothing with skin because he did not want them to be ashamed. And the reason why I can forgive, and the reason why I don't have to throw things that happen in people's face, and the reason why I can, is because the Lord did that for me. So I didn't have to be ashamed. And so I feel like I am giving people the gift of God when I don't do that. So that's my superpower, that I can let go.
I think that's an awesome superpower, forgiveness, child. No, my superpower is connecting. Right, I am a connector. And just the other day, one of my friends said of me that I am a person who can get a bunch of people in the same room working together who would never find themselves in the same room, but because I am a connector, I'm often the common denominator. And then I have in being a connector, I also have the ability to make people feel welcome. Right, that they have a space that you kind of belong here. This is home. Come take off your shoes and be you in this space. And in connecting, also they walk away from those spaces with new friends and new support systems that also carry on without my help. Right. I think that is being a connector and someone who creates spaces for folks to come despite their differences and just exist and then connect even with each other and journey on through life together as well.
Wow, we got some awesome superpowers here amongst the sisters today. I would have to say, I'm a people person as well. I love people, and I'm a hugger as well. And so, something funny is, sometimes during the pandemic, when they said you weren't supposed to hug people. I still had on the mask and all of that, but I had my Lysol. So I said, okay, we can spray with the Lysol, make sure everybody's good. But so one of my superpowers is I believe I am able to allow people to see the God in those who are same gender loving and those who are gay. Because as coming out later on in life as an LGBT individual, as a lesbian bishop, now people can see that the Holy Spirit can dwell in me, as well as I'm then able to affirm that the Holy Spirit can dwell in others. And so with that, I'm happy to be able to offer that to persons, because people sometimes think, okay, well, if you are married to a woman, then is the Holy Spirit still going to be in you? Are you still able to preach? Are you still able to get a prayer through? And people are able to see that. So that's a superpower that I believe I have. And I'm able to then also encourage others to use that in themselves. And then also I'm able to speak a word into people's spirit and help them to come up to where they need to be. And so I would say, if I had to relate to a woman in the Bible, it is probably Deborah, or some may call her Deborah, from the Judges, because she's able to speak, and then people are able to receive the word that is spoken. And so I just believe that, it's important that we always use those superpowers that God has given us, God has endowed within each and every one of us, so that the kingdom, those who need us most, can feel what we have been given to give out to others. And so I'm happy about those superpowers on today. And it's nothing better than to have a people person as a pastor, because believe me, I have been with some who are not. That's all I'm gonna say.
So thank you, ladies. And so thank you for joining us this evening. It has been my pleasure to serve as your host tonight. Remember, you can support the Women in Ministry and Wayland Baptist Theological Seminary via Cash App at $J Rebels, PayPal, and all the information is on the screen for your reference. Again, thank you. May the Lord bless you beyond measure is our prayer. The peace of the Lord be with all of you. Good night.
Good night.